That was a nice introduction. I'm remembering that line at this time, or introduction like that. Your mother would be proud. Your father would be amused. Good morning. Thank you to the University of Tulsa and to Professor Allison for this invitation. I'm Andy Black, President and CEO of the Association of Oil Pipelines. As Curtis said, we represent the owners and operators of the pipelines that transport crude oil, refined products like gasoline, diesel fuel, and jet fuel, and highly volatile liquids like natural gas liquids and propane and ethane. Tulsa is not just a great place that I like to visit. It's a perfect place to talk about midstream transportation, connecting producers to refiners and fractionators, and connecting refiners and fractionators to end-use markets. And it is even more perfect to talk about midstream in a museum founded by Thomas Gilcrease. Thomas Gilcrease, because of his Creek Nation lineage, was granted 160 acres southwest of here that, wonderfully, was over top of the Glenpool Oil Reserve. Oil had been found in Oklahoma before, but the Glenpool in 1905 was big, the next Spindletop, directly under the acreage that he had recently been given rights to at the age of 9 or 10. That provided income that helped him go to college and later start an exploration company. And one end result of a life of business success is the great collection all around you and the great facility that we're in today. I'm appreciative to the University of Tulsa and to the city of Tulsa for maintaining this facility. But the story of Glenpool shows the importance of pipelines then and now. The first pipelines in Oklahoma were small, built around 1900 to nearby rail loading facilities where crude oil would be put on a train and sent to a refinery. Then the Prairie Oil and Gas Company built a pipeline from here all the way to a refinery in Indiana owned by Standard Oil. The Glenpool produced more than that pipeline could handle, and the local railroad facilities became overwhelmed. Crude was stranded, and the price crashed. Even though this low sulfur crude was perfect for refining, the price dropped to under $1 per barrel. So what happened? Two pipeline operators recognized there was a value in building a pipeline from here, but to a different area. So Gulf Oil and Texas Oil, later Texaco, built two major 8-inch pipelines to connect the Glenpool refineries to Beaumont, Texas. And bam, the prices reached a healthier amount and development continued. With support for increased exploration and production, the rapid expansion of a pipeline network, and more refinery demand for Oklahoma crude, pipelines made it possible. A different place in Oklahoma is famous today for its role in crude oil and for demonstrating the role of pipelines. Cushing, Oklahoma is 57 miles west-southwest from here by car, says Google Maps. Small town with a lot of tanks. The local oil boom in Cushing started in 1912 with the Cushing Drumright Reserve, and a year later Cushing had a refinery. Production declined quickly from that field, but the refineries continued in business with crude oil brought in by rail and by pipeline. Finally, in 1982, the last two refineries closed and rail service into the area also closed. That could have been the end of the story for Cushing, Oklahoma, and the oil business. But it had 39 storage tanks and pipelines that could transport 1.5 million barrels per day. Some people recognized they were a huge asset. The storage tanks were used for storing crude that went in and out by pipeline, responding to developments in the market. So more storage tanks were built, and more pipeline connections were built, and then more storage, then more pipeline capacity, and so on. When you enter Cushing, you see this picture, and it's true. Cushing can be called the pipeline crossroads of the world. Today, Cushing has perhaps 65 million barrels in storage as of late last month. Acre after acre of storage tanks on all sides of town. This graphic from Business Week depicts how crude oil can come into Cushing or go out of Cushing from every conceivable direction. These are individual pipelines that are shown, and it probably doesn't show every one. Keystone XL from the north would have been another. Because of Cushing's supply, pipeline connections, and liquidity, the daily settlement price for West Texas intermediate crude delivered at Cushing is the benchmark for the U.S. spot market. There's even a cottage industry around what can be learned about oil markets by assessing storage levels in Cushing. Now to the great story of recent years, the growth in U.S. production of crude oil, natural gas, and natural gas liquids from shale reserves. One important part of this, from a midstream perspective, is how spread out this has been throughout the country. From South Texas to West Texas and Oklahoma, to Colorado and Wyoming, to North Dakota and Montana, and even the Big Ten, Midwest, with the finds in the Marcellus and the Utica. Here's our crude oil pipeline network as of a few years ago. Our legacy pipeline network, as great as it was, wasn't enough for that increased shale production. In many years, in many areas, the production capabilities exceeded the local pipeline takeaway capacity, so new pipelines needed to be built. Or in other cases, the local pipeline takeaway capacity was there, but it couldn't get that resource to where it would be most valued. Just like back in Glenpool, the crude was economically stranded in some places, and it was well worth the transportation cost of new midstream projects to get that crude to good markets. Competitors moved in to help shippers unlock the value associated with stranded crude. Railroads often have first mover advantage because the time required to add a rail loading or unloading facility is less than the time required to expand pipeline capacity or build a new pipeline network. And the upfront contract commitments required to support these investments are generally much smaller than what is needed to support a pipeline project. So the first part of the get shale production to market story involved a lot of crude by rail, as you no doubt heard. But the pipeline industry raced to catch up, and I'll show you some examples in a moment. The second great part of our pipeline network connects refineries to consumer markets. Refined products pipelines carry many different products from refinery, as Curtis said, gasoline, diesel fuel, jet fuel, and more, in separate batches, but on the same pipeline. Maybe several hours of low-octane gasoline, then several hours of jet, then ultra-low sulfur diesel, then of high-octane gasoline, then ultra-light hydrocarbons, and so on. This map is of Explorer Pipeline, headquartered right here in Tulsa. Explorer has long been known as a supplier of Midwest America from Texas and Oklahoma refineries. Explorer's business has evolved as markets and customer needs have evolved, and now carries also light hydrocarbons to the north where they can be used as a diluent with heavier crudes. Explorer is also known for Curtis Craig. Curtis is Vice President and General Counsel of Explorer, as he said. What he didn't tell you is he's a Tulsa College of Law alumnus, and he's a member of the Sustainable Energy and Resource Law Board of Visitors. He's a respected leader in our industry, and I want to thank him for introducing me today and being here. Explorer means a lot to Tulsa. Curtis means a lot to me. Here's the extensive refined products system of another great company, Magellan Midstream Partners, based here in Tulsa. An example of new construction in refined products lines to benefit consumers is from Magellan. It serves Fort Smith, Arkansas, in the western part of that state. But Little Rock, in the middle of the state, hasn't had access to mid-continent refined products, only from the Gulf. And Magellan is building a line from Fort Smith to Little Rock that will change that, to the benefit of Little Rock consumers. I should note Magellan's general counsel, as well, got a law degree from Tulsa. Growing good crop here. Doug May, another respected member of the AOPL Legal Committee. Here's our nation's refined products pipeline network. It hasn't had the growth of the crude oil market lately, but has experienced many changes as mid-continent refineries get access to crude with some of the lower prices of the country. I want to note the two lines moving from Texas and Louisiana eastward, through the South, up through the Carolinas and Virginia. One of them even stretches to New York Harbor. Much of the Southeast, Mid-Atlantic, and Northeast get their gasoline and refined products by pipeline from Texas and Louisiana. If those pipelines are ever down, the importance of pipelines to millions of Americans quickly becomes clear in our just-in-time market. Let's look at two recent times pipelines were affected due to hurricanes, Irene and Sandy. Most pipelines use electric power to pump product down the line, and power was affected by both storms. Sandy also included flooding of local terminals in the New York Harbor area, which meant that the product delivered by pipelines could not be reached for local delivery, even after the pipelines were ready to restore service. The bars in these charts show changes in gasoline stocks in the Northeast for a week. When the bars point down, inventories are moving lower. as they would when supply is interrupted or decreased. The line shows the price differential between wholesale gasoline purchases for delivery in New York Harbor minus the price of purchases for delivery in the Gulf Coast, the basis differential. The top case is Hurricane Irene in 2011. Several refined products pipelines were down about 3 or 4 days. Gasoline stocks fell 2 million barrels, or 7% from pre-storm levels. As inventories went down, the price went up 17 cents. The bottom case is Hurricane Sandy in 2012, which had impacts slower to develop but larger and longer lasting. Colonial Pipeline from Texas and Louisiana was down about 4 days, and some others a few days, and again terminals were affected. The drop in inventories was about 8%, and prices were 28 cents higher at one point. Katrina and Rita told similar stories of how consumers were at risk from shortages and price spikes when pipelines were unable to serve for reasons out of their control. Pipelines matter to consumers, even though most consumers don't know their gasoline is provided by a pipeline. Some people might see that tanker truck at the Quick Trip serving the gas station and think that the truck carried the gasoline all the way from the refinery. That's rarely the case. Usually pipelines carry that gasoline for miles, maybe hundreds of miles, until a truck can pick it up from a terminal and supply a local station. Supply and demand drives the price consumers pay at the pump, and pipelines play an essential role in moving supply to markets. The Federal Trade Commission reported that when pipelines serving an area expand, prices fall. An expert study covered one great example of this in Phoenix. The SFPP pipeline East Line expansion into Phoenix cost $300 million. The economic benefits to the area consumers of access to more lower-priced gasoline surpassed the cost of the project in just 18 months. And more recently, when gasoline prices peaked nationwide in 2012, DOE's Energy Information Administration found that those consumers with better access to pipelines in the Mountain West, Midwest, and South paid lower gasoline prices than the rest of the country. Most of the pipeline capacity growth in the U.S., as I was talking about earlier, has been in crude oil. Here are just some of the projects that have been put forward. SEM Group, with a Tulsa presence, has been adding pipelines and storage in Oklahoma and is an important local player. Over the last 10 years, we've added 18,000 miles of new crude oil pipelines into service, all funded by pipeline operators and investors, and not the taxpayer. It's important to note that not every pipeline capacity expansion project is a new greenfield construction project. Companies have been adding capacity on existing pipelines by adding drag-reducing agents or increasing horsepower on the pumps that push the product, all within maximum pressure guidelines established by our safety regulator at the U.S. Department of Transportation. Other projects involve companies wisely repurposing underused parts of the existing pipeline network. A company might convert a pipeline from one type of service, say refined products or natural gas, to one of a greater value for its customers, say crude oil. Conversions the other direction have happened too over history. A pipeline operator might also reverse the flow of a pipeline, as was famously done by the Seaway crude pipeline between Oklahoma and Texas, and in other cases. Pipelines always brought crude oil from south to north, and Cushing was filled with barrels from the Gulf Coast, among elsewhere. But today, the market values those Cushing barrels moving north to south, down to the Gulf Coast, a revolutionary change that pipelines have adapted to. I mentioned railroads have first-mover advantages in the race to serve shippers' needs. This chart shows the amount of crude oil moved per day from the Midwest into various regions of the country over time by railroads. As the Bakken Shale-producing region of North Dakota and Montana became prolific, the existing pipeline network was not able to move enough quantity. It wasn't meant to. It hadn't been built for that much production. So what happened? Look at the red line showing barrels per day moved by rail from the Midwest to the Gulf Coast. It went way up in 2011 and stayed up through 2012. Bakken crude cost so much less than other crudes available for refiners on the Gulf Coast that the cost of railroad transportation, more expensive than a pipeline, was worth it. There just wasn't enough pipeline capacity. Pipelines are usually the least expensive mode for transporting liquids over land, but they take longer to develop. Look what happens in the second half of 2013 and through 2014, As pipeline capacity expands to the area, barrels move from the more expensive route railroads to the less expensive route pipelines. Now take the blue line, showing shipments to the East Coast. In 2013, the long trip on the train from the Bakken to the East Coast was worth it because of how Bakken crude was priced against Atlantic Basin Brent crude, and crude by rail surged. There aren't any pipelines connecting the Bakken to the East Coast. Pipelines can get you part of the way, but we still need railroads to help carry the oil some of the way. Because pipelines never expanded to the East Coast from the Bakken, the primary factor limiting Bakken crude by rail to the East Coast is simply the cost differential versus what East Coast refiners could buy off a waterborne transporter. When that differential dropped, as overall crude prices dropped, the amounts shipped east have decreased. The same is generally true of the yellow line, showing shipments to the Pacific by rail. No pipelines go from the Pacific, from the North Dakota to the West Coast, and the primary issue has again been the cost differential. If any of you would like to walk out of here and build a pipeline from North Dakota to the Atlantic or the Pacific Coast, I'm ready to cheer you on. And then I'll ask you to become a member. But nobody's done it. No pipeline operator builds or expands a pipeline on spec, of course. The operator and its investors need to know that a subsequent stream of revenue is likely. Most often, in today's pipeline market, the pipeline operator negotiates with its customers or shippers an agreement for a contract to move a minimum volume for a period of time for an agreed-upon rate. That gives the shippers the confidence the infrastructure will be there to get the product to market, and gives the pipeline operator the confidence it will be paid. These contracts, often referred to as long-term contracts, are for 20, 15, 10, even 5 years now, far short of the commercially useful life of the pipeline. Every pipeline expansion, even one supported by contract rates, is at risk. Interstate liquids pipeline transportation, shorthanded as oil pipelines, is regulated under the Interstate Commerce Act. The act was passed in 1887. Oil pipelines were added by the Hepburn Act of 1906. The Interstate Commerce Act has been mostly repealed and replaced by other statutes, but not for oil pipelines. Under the ICA, a pipeline offering interstate service must be a common carrier. Rates must be just and reasonable, and there cannot be any undue discrimination or preference given to one shipper over another. There was a time in American history where transportation by pipelines and railroads did involve discrimination and preference, and protecting against that remains a very important part of our economic regulation today. The Interstate Commerce Commission regulated oil pipelines until the creation of the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission in 1977. Pipelines file tariffs with Ferc and must post them for all shippers to see. Ferc regulates rates and practices, terms and conditions. The left side of this chart shows what is regulated by Ferc under the Interstate Commerce Act, and a number of areas that are not regulated by Ferc on the right-hand side. The left has your standard terms and conditions of service, rates and charges, annual reporting following specific accounting rules, and the fact that no pipeline operator can disclose any shipper information, which must be kept confidential from the whole market. The right side reflects the wisdom of Congress and the President to allow pipeline operators, regulated as shown on the left, to respond quickly to competition. Pipeline operators who carry liquids do not go to Ferc to ask for permission to build a pipeline or abandon service. It makes sense because you don't need to ask for permission to stop service for oil pipelines, because under our common carrier statute, our customers can also walk away. Oil pipelines are not public utilities. The Interstate Commerce Act does not cover sales and leases of assets. Now, asset sales would, of course, be covered under the general antitrust laws and regulations. And the Interstate Commerce Act does not cover pipeline safety, but other statutes and regulators do. So the key elements of economic regulation of oil pipelines are, number one, common carriage. No discrimination or preference, can't turn anybody down, treat any affiliates just as you would any other shipper. Number two, unregulated entry and exit. This has allowed operators to quickly adjust service to respond to customer needs. Ironically, the one time Ferc causes delays in providing a new service is when a pipeline operator wants to switch a natural gas pipeline to liquid service and has to apply for formal abandonment under the Natural Gas Act in order to do so. Number three, competitive markets. Ferc and the Interstate Commerce Act recognize pipelines are not public utilities with franchise markets, and instead they compete vigorously with each other and with other modes of transportation. And number four, an incentive and market-based regulatory model. I'll explain that in a moment. Rate making under FERC regulation. If this was an easier slide, oil pipelines wouldn't be as interesting, and we wouldn't need Curtis. Most oil pipelines offer index rates, in which their maximum rate goes up or down according to an index methodology determined by FERC. That's just the maximum rate a pipeline may find they can't support the maximum rate in competition and must charge less. Next, market-based rates. FERC recognizes that in some markets, the pipeline does not have any opportunity to exercise market power and is approved to charge rates determined by competition in the market. Refined products transportation in the middle of the country, including here, have many markets in which FERC allows market-based rates. A company beginning new service would offer initial rates determined either by a cost-of-service methodology for shippers not signing a contract or an initial rate negotiated with shippers who do. Pipeline operators might offer rates determined by settlements with shippers who were perhaps in rate case before a settlement. A limited number of pipeline operators still offer cost-of-service rates, but not many, and it doesn't really fit into our model. And finally, grandfathered rates. Some pipelines had rates grandfathered by Congress in 1992, and their maximum rates are set by the index. The late Congressman Mike Sinar was a big player in the oil pipelines provision of the Energy Policy Act. As I was discussing with Professor Allison this morning, we lost him way too early. This pie chart shows that most rates in interstate oil transportation are index rates, the darker blue section. Approximately 84% of tariff filings are related to index rates. Next is market-based rates, represented by the light blue 10% of tariff filings. Settlement rates are next in red, and cost-of-service filings are a small sliver in green, only about 1% of filings. So what's the deal about index rates, and why do we start using them? The 1992 Energy Policy Act told FERC to use a simplified and generally applicable rate-making methodology. Do something general that applies to all for all rates that had not been subject to complaints. FERC did just that and established a methodology to have maximum rates or ceiling rates rise or fall based on an index. The Ferc methodology uses historical data of cost changes for liquid pipelines and maps that against a government-reported index of cost changes as a comparison. FERC has used the Producer Price Index for Finished Goods, PPIFG, published by the Labor Department's Bureau of Statistics, and every 5 years determines how to adjust that for liquid pipelines for the next 5 years. Each year, the pipeline operator can file to increase maximum rates only by amount that index changed the previous year, plus an adder from FERC to attempt to make things equal. If the PPIFG drops for a year by more than the adder, the pipeline must file to decrease its maximum rates. That will happen this year. FERC recently finished its most recent 5-year index review and set a new index of PPIFG plus 1.23% that will be in effect for annual adjustments starting this year. They did it differently than they'd ever done it before, and we've appealed this to the D.C. Circuit, but that's a story for another speech. Index-based regulation provides incentives. The pipeline operator has a built-in incentive to operate efficiently because it captures the difference between the rates they charge and the costs they pay. There's no aspect of cost-of-service rate-making here where a company simply gets a return on rate base and is therefore rewarded for increasing rate base. No, here operators do not have the incentive to increase costs. Every 5 years, when the FERC reviews the index adder for the next 5 years, it considers how costs have changed for oil pipelines during the previous review period. If a pipeline operator has been able to operate efficiently, its costs reported to FERC and used in the rate index proceeding will be less. Any cost efficiencies are used to calculate the adder for the next 5 years, which helps pipeline shippers gain lower maximum rates because of these efficiencies. For those companies that pay market-based rates, they have the same incentive to operate efficiently, and their cost changes are used in index calculations as well. Fewer rate cases, downward pressure on maximum rates, no incentive to gold plate your system, and every incentive to operate efficiently. Brilliant. I want to be sure to add, though, that a company does not consider pipeline safety, spending, and investments to be an area for gaining cost efficiencies. Companies are under comprehensive safety regulations by the Department of Transportation, spend more than $2.2 billion as an industry on integrity management each year, and are steadily improving the industry safety record in our pursuit of zero releases. The developer of a pipeline project will work with shippers before dirt is ever turned to develop long-term contract rate agreements. These rate agreements are essential and are developed essentially during an open season process. In an open season, you post a notice for all to see that there's an opportunity to enter into a rate agreement for a long-term volume commitment on new pipeline capacity. Because oil pipelines are common carriers, we treat everybody equally, and everybody who agrees to a contract in the open season should have rates, terms, and conditions that are not unduly discriminatory or preferential. A pipeline operator, having reached these agreements, may ask FERC ahead of time for assurances that these rates, terms, and conditions are not going to be disapproved. Pipelines do that through a process called a petition for declaratory order. FERC, please declare in an order that we're going to be okay. Please approve these committed shipper rates and other contract terms prior to us starting to build this pipeline. It's a very important process. Pipeline operators need continued stability and certainty from FERC about its contracts and how they will be regulated. This development of petitions for declaratory order, or PDOs, has contributed to the success of the liquids build-out of the past decade. Over the last 10 years, 33,000 miles of liquid pipelines have been added into service. The 18,000 miles for crude I mentioned, plus another 15,000 for highly volatile liquids like natural gas liquids. ONEOK, from here in Tulsa, of course, is a major player in natural gas liquids transportation as well as natural gas. And with Williams, another great Tulsa company, they together own the Overland Pass natural gas liquid pipeline as an example. Now, I did not go to law school, as is probably already become apparent. But I think you'll learn in law school that sometimes things just do not go as you expect in cases. FERC commissioners have consistently issued orders supporting contract rates. We had no reason to doubt they would change. But in a FERC rate case on another issue, an administrative law judge said FERC should not honor these contract rate agreements made with shippers for the Seaway crude pipeline expansion. Holy cow. Or to a certain type of oil pipeline observer, Whiskey Tango Foxtrot. In a very entertaining to read series of FERC orders, FERC first remanded the case to the judge, telling her not to mess with contract rates and affirming its long-held policy. When she reached a second initial decision that again challenged those same contract rates, FERC issued a second order upholding them and explaining who had authority to do what. We applauded FERC commissioners for making this clear because, again, contract rates are essential for getting the financing necessary to build pipelines. Let's turn to what other approvals are necessary for building a pipeline. The Interstate Commerce Act has no federal eminent domain authority for liquids pipelines, like the Natural Gas Act does for natural gas pipelines. We get cited under state laws. We still need environmental permits for construction activities, some of which are federal and some of which are state. We still need, I've listed below, some of the types of permits we need, notably Clean Water Act permits. Those can be gotten. The timing sometimes stretches longer than we would like. As you're probably aware, pipeline construction projects in recent years have drawn opposition from some groups, partly as a means to keep fossil fuels in the ground. While most pipeline projects continue to move forward despite the opposition, the process now takes more time, and project sponsors incur significant costs to respond to this opposition. Of course, we believe pipeline construction furthers the public interest as pipelines bring new sources of supply to markets for the benefit of energy consumers and are the safest and most environmentally friendly method of transporting energy liquids. The list of federal agencies we need to deal with can be long. If we want to cross federal lands, of course, we need to deal with the Land Management Agency. Pipeline operators often use the nationwide permit process of the Army Corps of Engineers for Clean Water Act related permits. The Corps' use of the nationwide permit process was challenged in the last few years by groups trying to stop pipeline construction, but the courts upheld the government's authority. In addition, while not a permitting requirement, the Department of Transportation's Pipeline and Hazardous Materials Safety Administration, or PHMSA, is also involved in construction oversight and inspection in even the early stages of a project. There's no one federal agency acting as lead agency for permits, as there is with natural gas pipelines who have FERC as a lead agency, pushing other agencies to meet deadlines. The one exception is a cross-border project like Keystone XL and some others, where the Department of State serves as the lead federal agency in issuing a presidential permit, or not. Oil pipelines are in front of state agencies for siting and construction much more than our natural gas pipeline partners. If a state's laws say a public service commission or public utility commission should be a part of siting or eminent domain for an oil pipeline, we start there, even if the pipeline will be completely or mostly in interstate commerce. The state environmental agencies may have a role in the PUC process and would give any permits for water body work that is not under the Corps of Engineers. Sometimes we need to work with agricultural agencies to address impacts and state transportation departments for when we cross roads and other areas under their jurisdiction. There are commonly public hearings as part of the siting process, allowing affected landowners to air any concerns. While eminent domain rights are often allowed under state laws, pipelines typically build a project by negotiating rights-of-way agreements directly with landowners without needing to rely on eminent domain or relying on it only for a limited portion of the project. There were a lot of agencies and permits listed on those last few slides. I'm sorry, it's harder for pipeline operators than it is for you. A pipeline operator is ready to work with those agencies and get whatever permits are needed, but we need prompt, timely decisions. If a pipeline has reached agreements with its shippers for a long-term deal to increase pipeline capacity, that shipper needs the pipeline to get built. Those customers and end-use customers suffer when the permitting process takes longer than it needs to. AOPL has called on agencies to have sufficient resources to do their work. There are times when an agency will allow a pipeline operator to provide funds for independent work to assist government decision-making, and often a pipeline operator is willing to pay that. Keystone XL was very different than other projects, but it was a great example of how a delay in a decision can come at great cost to shippers and end users, even before its unfortunate rejection on grounds of symbolism. The Keystone XL project sponsor, TransCanada, had every single state permit they needed and were just waiting for the State Department approval of that last little section that crosses the American border. We've all heard how many jobs would have been created by Keystone XL. There were tax revenues that would have been accrued to local governments along the right-of-way. There was lower-priced crude from Canada and the Bakken that would have become more available to Gulf Coast refiners than ever before, supporting thousands of American refinery workers who would be able to move off higher-costing crude from outside North America, and millions of consumers who would have benefited from competing refineries having access to lower-costing crude. But for every Keystone XL, there are many projects that go forward, but suffer time delays for other reasons. We're still building pipelines today, and pipelines bring benefits. These pipelines are built without government money, but rely on smart regulation and timely permit decisions. Here in Tulsa, at Mr. Gilcrease's museum, and a short drive from Cushing, we see how pipelines and midstream transportation mattered 100 years ago and matter today, when midstream capacity is less than the market needs. Because capacity hasn't gotten built, or can't get approved, or is down because of a storm, the public loses. Thank you for spending time with me today, thinking about midstream infrastructure and pipelines, which make it all possible. Now that we're at the time for questions, I'd love to have a discussion. Thank you.